So happy to see you all here. I have the distinct pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker today. I was just talking to him about a dear friends of ours who are Hamilton College grads. If you don't know Hamilton, it's a very high quality school in upstate New York, excellent reputation, in spite of graduating in one geologist that probably just underrepresents the college territory. Before I jump in completely, it looks like most of you have already found the food, so please continue to nosh and help yourself to drinks. I want to mention that the funding for the food and beverages was generously funded by one of our trustees, Jan Kaufman, and her husband and alumnus, John. And so I want to give a shout out to the Kaufmans for that generous gift. Also, DigLibArts is grateful to the Mellon Foundation, who not only is funding this event, but of course funds the entire DigLibArts program. So, wonderful addition to the college. Our speaker today, Angel David Nieves, holds joint appointments at both Hamilton College here in the U.S., as well as the University of Witwatersrand. I blew it. I told him I should have chickened out. Witwatersrand, or University of Wit in Johannesburg, South Africa. At Hamilton, he's an associate professor of Africana Studies. He also is the director of the American Studies program and one of the founding members of the Cinema and Media Studies concentration. He's bored. His work lies at the juncture of the digital humanities, media studies, and Black studies. He has published widely in all of these fields, both in print and in digital formats. He is a leader of a growing effort to diversify the types of projects that we see and the research methods used in the digital humanities. Angel founded and directs, as I mentioned, the Digital Humanities Initiative at Hamilton. This is a project which has not only inspired many other colleges to try to emulate the great program they have, but certainly we have drawn inspiration from the excellent projects and program that they've developed there. Angel today will be talking about a project that he has designed and built up alongside undergraduates. This speaks to the heart of what we love to hold dearly here at our college, which is the interaction of our faculty and staff with our students as we co-create new knowledge and scholarship. So this is an example of researchers working with undergraduates to create scholarship that isn't just provincial, but really has a broad influence on a greater audience in the world. As you listen to Angel speak today, please feel free to share your notes and thoughts with the rest of the audience and the world by tweeting to #DigLibArts. Even if you're a Luddite like me, you can see other audience members' notes on the side screens, so you'll be able to see what's happening there. At the end of the talk, there's also going to be time for questions, and so write them down so you don't forget them. Advice my graduate professor gave me. But also, if you have to cut out like I do, sadly, you can watch it. It will be recorded and hosted on the DigLibArts website. Or if you want to share it with somebody that can't be here or far away from here. So for future reference, you'll have access to that, as well as an interview that Angel did earlier today with some DigLibArts student technology liaisons. So, without further ado, or me mispronouncing any more universities, please welcome Angel Nieves to Whittier College to talk about geospatial visualizations of testimony, developing a social justice platform for digital humanities.
Hopefully this is projecting. Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Andrea Wren and my colleagues at the Digital Liberal Arts Center and Sonia and Eli here at Whittier College for their hospitality today. I'm especially grateful to Veronica for securing all the necessary arrangements for this visit. I've enjoyed my conversations thus far with students, faculty, and staff from across the college and feel very fortunate to have been asked to speak here today. I've long been an admirer of the work that Whittier has been doing in digital liberal arts, and we share many common traits and many common desires for the ways in which we want to promote digital scholarship in partnership with undergraduate students, and I hope today to give you a little bit of insight into some of the work that we've been doing. By way of introduction, over the past 2 decades as a scholar of race in the built environment, I've long been preoccupied with the disappearance and erasure of cultural landscapes across the African diaspora. As a public historian grounded in the field of African American women's history, I've had the unique opportunity to advocate for the preservation and in some instances, the commemoration of the material artifacts of communities of color here in the US and across the African continent. I see much of my scholarly work and practice as a part of a much broader focus at the intersections of social justice, digital humanities, and Africana studies. Much of that work is situated in understanding the role of place and placemaking among the most marginalized members of our society, although that marginalization has also meant that many of these communities have empowered themselves in very unique ways. I would like to give you a little overview of current debates in the digital humanities as they impact people of color, and in particular, women of color. Moya Bailey's 2011 article in the Journal of Digital Humanities, entitled, "All the Digital Humanists Are White, All the Nerds Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave," made clear how we have failed to examine the ways in which identities inform both theory and practice in digital humanities. Her wordplay on Gloria Hull's groundbreaking book of 1982, entitled, "All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave, Black Women's Studies," makes clear a much-needed connection between our past as the marginalized, including the racial and ethnic other, the queer and the transgendered, and today's critical ethnic studies scholars who, along with those of us working to transform the field of digital humanities, often remain sidelined in the conversation as to the humanities' future. Bailey highlights how the move from margin to center offers those already marginalized in society and in the academy in what some might see as the liminal spaces of the field, helping to recenter the focus on the lives of women, people of color, and the disabled. It is an understatement for me, as someone who's worked for the past 7 years, to radically shift the discussion from a field focused on aspects of white male privilege and the heteronormative nerd, to say that this transformation is a challenge. The emergence of digital humanities as a field is said by some to have started in the 1990s, while others have argued that its history is much earlier than that. It begins in the 1940s with Father Roberto Busa, considerably later in some ways than the work of scholars who were working to transform the academy beginning in the late 1960s. As a scholar who's worked to build and support new academic programs and the establishment of innovative research centers with a focus on interdisciplinary research and how constructions of race have shaped the American experience, I'm particularly excited about the prospect of a comprehensive digital humanities research program on the African diaspora, its history and culture, with a particular focus on the Global South. Speaking as a senior scholar in African American studies and in African diaspora studies, I believe it becomes important to help shape future generations of scholars and their scholarship by working tirelessly in support of cutting-edge field making, supporting faculty who to some extent are sidelining their own scholarship in service to an emerging field of study. It is also important to note that several NEH Office of Digital Humanities funded projects have addressed the need for creating guidelines that facilitate the evaluation of digital scholarship and works that engage the public. Here, NINES, the Network Infrastructure for 19th Century Electronic Scholarship, and its sister group, 18th Connect, provide external review for digital work in their subject areas. Unfortunately, those types of interventions have relegated many of these discussions to a very specific community of scholars with little effort in making those guidelines more widely used and accepted. However, more specifically about the lengthy process of creating digital scholarship, including the making of platforms, experimental software, and the building of sustainable digital infrastructures, is needed, and perhaps with the use of sample projects as part of those guidelines, our colleagues in fields outside the humanities who sit on university or college-wide tenure and promotion committees can begin to be better informed about the changes we are already seeing in peer review. For example, does the digital project have the potential of evolving and improving over time in ways that are not possible or available in other formats and other media? How might we prepare our colleagues to answer the particular question as they review our scholarship? Despite the changes in our larger socio-political landscape and intellectual lives, because of transnational feminist knowledge production and on-the-ground organizing by women of color, some of this theorizing has still not reached a vast array of disciplines or fields, including digital history or spatial history. Case in point, both theorizing and outlining effective strategies as to how the internet in South Africa could help transform the legacy of apartheid if harnessed by grassroots memory and community-based organizations in the former all-Black townships is still relatively new and recent. Post-colonial and transnationalist feminist Chandra Mohanty perhaps best captures the discomforting truth in feminism, quote, that historical differences across class, like race, but more so than sexuality, and gender privileges of which feminists must remain cognizant, end of quote. So neoliberalism's damage to feminist gains over the past 4 decades in both the global north and south make the long-standing geopolitical divide less crucial, while a new space for action has been made available. A radical feminist archive-making process working with and through various community-based projects allows one to discover ways of leveraging those changes and bringing together cultural and memory workers from the global north and south. So far, I've raised a series of issues that I confront on a daily basis in my own digital scholarship because so much of our work in cultural heritage preservation or in 3D virtual heritage makes use of commercial software products that are primarily designated facilitating the gaming industry. The cultural, social, and political baggage that comes with the adoption of this technology cannot be ignored, overlooked, or conveniently pushed aside. And I understand this as a result of my own privilege from the global north and as a part of the electronics industrial complex or of the military industrial academic complex. This focus on justice is very much at the core of what I'm grappling with in my work in the global south, specifically with residents of Soweto, a predominantly Black apartheid-era suburb outside of Johannesburg, South Africa. This is very much also a project in media archaeology, as a methodology in critical media studies, where the centrality of the archive is of utmost importance. If we are to understand the current state of the post-colonial archive in South Africa, we must remember that Michel Foucault's contribution to our understanding of the archaeology of knowledge and culture was his emphasis on it as a methodology for excavating conditions of existence. The series of projects I've been involved with over the past decade have very much been an excavation of the material objects in the archive produced by technologies of the apartheid state and, as I've argued elsewhere, reflective of the spatial locations of resistance in response to state-sponsored terrorism and countless human rights violations. Black feminist geographer Catherine McCritchick writes, quote, "Black matters are spatial matters," and end of quote. And this is an issue I also pursue in my forthcoming book manuscript on 19th century African-American women reformers in the post-Reconstruction South. I sort of situate myself in a number of different areas and felt it was important to do a little sales pitch for the book when it comes out at some point. In her simple statement, McCritchick provides us with a way of conceptualizing Black geographies as the terrain of political struggle itself and where this struggle takes place. If we look at the limitations and possibilities found in the kinds of modernist spatial arrangements made by the apartheid state across South Africa's all-Black townships, we begin to see the interconnections between the metaphorical and the material terrain of struggle. Works by Julian Rose, May Po Kwan, Laura Pulido, and Mona Domash have all helped to expand our understanding as to how feminist methodologies and epistemologies allow for a more dynamic way of seeing how power works to produce social, economic, and cultural differences spatially. Examining forms of resistance at various scales, from the micro to the macro, will also allow us to document the ways in which, for example, activists such as Steve Biko, and this is part of a new project that we are currently undertaking with the Steve Biko Foundation in Ginsburg, South Africa, to begin recording 1,000 interviews of members who participated in the Black consciousness movement, and to make that publicly available on an open source archive. how someone like Biko came to Soweto from the Eastern Cape. So in many ways, trying to understand the kinds of transnational networks that developed between scholars, activists, not just in South Africa from different provinces, but also those kinds of transnational networks that occurred with the United States and Europe and South Africa as they worked to end apartheid. So much of my work in the spatial humanities as a field relies upon powerful geospatial technologies and methods to explore new questions about the relationship of space to human behavior and social, economic, political, and cultural development, which I will discuss in a little more detail. I'm now quoting from a forthcoming article I have just co-written with Elaine Sullivan of UC Santa Cruz and Lisa Snyder of UCLA, entitled Making the Model, Scholarship and Rhetoric in 3D Historical Reconstructions. We write, quote, three-dimensional virtual reconstruction models of historic sites as a new form of knowledge production should be seen as a new form of knowledge production equivalent to traditional textual analysis. The process of making a computer model asks scholars to perform the same steps as described above, with the difference that the final product is in a visual as opposed to textual form. To design a research project focused on a reconstruction of a now disappeared or altered historic places, the scholar must identify a question that is best, or sometimes can only be best answered, when considering space and spatial relationships in 3 dimensions. In each step of the building process, or this reconstruction process, the researcher must select and discard information, weighing its validity and pertinence to the research being addressed. The resulting model is not a neutral representation of the past, but the scholar's interpretation of specific aspects of a place at a certain moment in time, an interpretation that can be challenged, revised, or rejected by others. 3D reconstruction models should thus not be viewed as illustrations or simple representations of an incontestable past, but instead as a form of rhetoric, here in visual form, akin to that of the traditional scholarly argument. End of quote. Sorry, that was a long one. So now returning to my research in South Africa, it is without dispute that the morning of June 16, 1976, marking the beginning of the Soweto Uprising, is an exemplary moment in the common officializing memory of South Africa's Black townships. Then, Black African students, marching to protest the adoption of Afrikaans as a primary language of instruction for schools in Johannesburg's southwestern townships, or Soweto, were gunned down by members of the South African police and security forces. The physical backdrop to these events, the so-called model native township of Soweto, was made up of a series of systematically planned would-be South African garden cities with the primary purpose of reinforcing the powers and capacities of the state system of apartheid. Physical spaces such as these, built under apartheid, have been providing the social, political, and economic context for Black urban life since the founding of Johannesburg in 1886 to the present. However, few studies have considered the historical significance of these townships as extant physical artifacts of a difficult past or of a difficult heritage. This is particularly timely as townships now face complex heritage issues and the concurrent pressures of the international tourist market eager for township tours. My work in Soweto began with a prototype for Soweto 76, a living digital archive, where I served as a faculty fellow at the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities at the University of Maryland College Park. Soweto 76 is a prototype online multimedia archive of the holdings of Johannesburg's Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum. Using existing oral histories, testimonies, photographs, video footage, material objects, and sound recordings in the collections of the Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum, the work seeks to redress the existing portrayal of the lives of township residents in the mainstream or official historical record. The project prototype was completed in 2008. I always have to laugh when we are starting to talk about 2008 as the past, as the distant past, particularly when we think about technology and its advances. So the Soweto Historical GIS project, enlisting scholars and researchers at both Hamilton and Middlebury colleges under the sponsorship of Hamilton's DHI, examines the microgeography of resistance on the part of South Africa's township residents and the layering of meaning and action engendered in built form during the former apartheid regime. The 3D visualization of historical GIS in a virtual world that addresses questions of power and reconciliation and using gaming conventions to represent indigenous cultures, particularly in South Africa, as related to racial segregation, colonialism, and resistance against the state through the built environment has never been accomplished until now, which I'm hoping to show you here today. I will argue that reparations through the use of virtual testimony coupled with 3D historical reconstructions is both possible and a way of promoting social justice for victims of the apartheid state. The Soweto Historical GIS project began in 2011, as I said, working with 3 undergraduate students in the Department of Geography at Middlebury. We do not have a Department of Geography at Hamilton, so it was important to try to find project partners. So I found a project partner, Ann Kelly Knowles, who's a well-known historical GIS expert and who has been training students in historical GIS for many years. We worked together to begin building a historical GIS database drawn from a collection of 39 largely unseen maps, architectural plans, and drawings discovered at the National Archives of South Africa. These documents, developed by architects, engineers, and city planners, and dating from the period of the 1890s to the 1950s and 60s, provide great insights into the design and construction of these model township communities for the city of Johannesburg during the apartheid era. That these existing idealized township designs were never realized for a variety of political, social, and economic factors is a topic that no researcher has yet to discuss in the fields of historical GIS and historical geography. So what I'm going to do now is play a video in the background, and I'm going to try to keep the sound muted. The Soweto Historical GIS project release of its social justice history platform, which you're seeing here, is a software platform designed to represent geographic and spatial data within an enhanced interface designed to conceptualize locations and objects alongside the primary source documents that provide their historical narrative. As a 3D and virtual reality-enabled platform built atop the Unity game engine, the Social Justice History platform is able to represent both 2D geospatial information, such as maps, photographs, and records, and 3D representations of landscapes, locations, and 3D models of historical buildings and objects. The platform also lets users explore changes to those locations or objects over the course of a defined timeline of its history, allowing for an interactive view that lets users step back or forward through a location's changes over time. Beyond just the representation of the locations themselves, the Social Justice History platform also provides for a contextual experience of its locations by the addition of a suite of multimedia tools, allowing support for primary source documents, videos, oral histories, photographs, maps, and links to other locations in the history viewer. All of these multimedia documents are enabled for display directly within the 3D frame of the Social Justice History platform, allowing users to keep these documents open alongside the 3D frame as they explore a location and its timeline. Finally, the Social Justice History platform is designed to be an entirely web-based platform, able to be both accessed and run directly from a user's web browser. Thematically, a central overall goal of this project is the communication of the contrast between the plans and the realities of urban planning in such regions and the ways in which segregationist policies advanced human rights violations. By utilizing a 3D environment, we believe visualizing these differences will provide a striking and effective communication of the project's messages, able to show at once the things that were built within the township, and perhaps equally important, the things that were not. Moreover, as a largely historical project, the changes to this region over time will be a central goal of the 3D environment, leveraging its dynamic capabilities to show the township in various states of construction and change over the last 120 years. We believe it will prove equally compelling to compare the original construction plans against both the evolving and the modern states of the township. As seen in the physical changes to the Mandela House over just a 50-year period, we can begin to understand the importance of its microhistory in relation to the changes in policy at the local, provincial, and national levels. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, in continuing with the theme of historic data, across different scales and times, we plan to utilize this 3D environment as an access point for our vast holdings of archival media related to the area, its people, its government, and history. We envision a unique kind of geolocated archive where our digital multimedia assets, as shown, can be tagged by geographic coordinates, but also associated with individual 3D features such as buildings, city blocks, or regions as interactive elements of the virtual model. Finding new ways to map testimony about human rights violations and atrocities is by far the most important feature of the Social Justice History platform. By coding this social justice archive and its materials by both location and time, this kind of interactive cityscape would allow the archive's users to watch the city both grow and play out as a historical narrative, all enhanced and enlivened by the ability to reach down into the city at any historic moment and explore a particular moment in that site's history, coupled with the voices and testimony they might provide about the anti-apartheid struggle. Pivoting now from the macro to the micro level, my work on the Nelson Mandela House in Soweto provides evidence of digital tools to also explore the intimate geography of the township home. As South African women's studies scholar Habiba Badaroon points out, ideas about domesticity in South Africa were frequently used as a weapon in the colonial power struggles between and among Europeans and Africans. Ways of talking about houses and domesticity were also then ways of talking about the justification for conquest. For Badaroon, the history of South African household, both black and white, can only be what she calls a shadowed one. She writes, "The veiled, hidden abode of reproduction, the household, made possible the ultra-exploitability of domestic workers." End of quote. Interactions, both public and private, were deeply structured in space, marked by ritualized practices and entrenched inequality. Some have even argued that because of the sheer scale of the challenges imposed by apartheid's policies over space through architecture, city planning, and other forms of control, South Africans have yet to arrive at home. My work shows that the domestic sphere for black women in the townships was home, despite attempts by apartheid's engineers who sought the active destruction of the family structure through the creation of these dormitory enclaves designed to export their energies. On the contrary, these single-sex hostels and townships could be self-sustaining areas if we were to begin analyzing them very differently than what has been done up until now as a fundamentally geographical project. We have yet to fully explore the intimate geography of the house and its many complexities in the township. In particular, a recasting of microhistory popularized in the 1970s into a kind of spatial microhistory could allow for a bridge between historical studies using GIS and historical GIS with qualitative data from digital ethnographies. In other words, a spatial microhistory works from the premise that both the social and cultural history of everyday individuals can be inferred through the use of various interdisciplinary research methods, including feminist geography, critical race theory, and feminist GIS. This might allow us to begin understanding the network of individuals from across the various townships who participated in the student uprisings of 1976, where so much of my work is focused, and how those activist networks were embedded into the physical geography and architecture of individual houses. So I'm about to show you a video clip, which is part of a series of interviews conducted in 2008 with members of the Mandela family. The interviews were conducted as part of a comprehensive tourism planning and heritage redevelopment project that included the Mandela House. Many of these heritage projects were in preparation at the time for the 2010 FIFA World Cup that was held across South Africa. Haley Sharp, an international tourism, heritage, and visual communications management solutions company, was appointed by the Soweto Heritage Trust, I'm always tripped up by that name, could they add any more words, to undertake the research and restoration of the Mandela's family home at 8115 Vilakazi Street. Haley Sharp was also asked to include plans for the design and construction of the new visitor facilities and an interpretation plan. Many of these interviews remain unseen and will make up part of a forthcoming Omeka WordPress online archive publication entitled 8115 Vilakazi. And these are just some of the sample visualizations of our work thus far. The interviews include Winnie Madikizela Mandela, her two daughters Zinani, born in 1959, and Zinziwe, born in 1960, and the documentary photographer Alf Kumalo. Zinani, I want to say, was age 4 when her father was sent to prison, and she was not able to visit him in prison until 1974 when she was 16 years old. Zinziwe Mandela, or Zinzi, is the younger of his two daughters.
two-roomed house. I never forgave the father for getting that particular house. It was 2 rooms. He was the first resident there, and he was working at the at the offices, at the superintendent's offices. Then he was given a choice to go and choose a house. They were building those houses at the time, and he chose that corner house. It was dreadful at the time. When I got there, it was never touched, no change, nothing. Even the sink, the kitchen sink, was the old apartheid cement sink, which was so dirty, it was difficult to wash off. And then, of course, there were no doors. They had curtains, clothes, literally. It wasn't even proper curtains separating the rooms. And no bathrooms, nothing. It was just a 2-roomed house with a toilet at the back, outside, of course, with a red stoop. That was the glory of the house at the time, and we competed with the neighbors about shining the stoop. It was the first thing you looked at when you got to a house, how clean the stoop was, and you could mirror yourself on the stoop. And mine was red. Others in the area were black, but mine was red. And then the steps at the back were raw brick cement steps. It was so inconvenient. It wasn't a house at all. But when we were moved from that house, I remember her remark when I was banished to Brantford. She said, "Man, I didn't know 8115 was a palace." And that hurt me so much. How are we going to live here in Brantford? Anyhow, it was such a struggle to get her father to understand that the house needed improvements. It wasn't a house at all.
So I'm not trying to reify the heroine figure here through my discussion or by presenting this clip of Winnie Mandela. In many ways, repeating the trappings. Oh, my mic is on. Sorry. Is that on now? Yeah, okay. Sorry. I'm not trying to reify the sort of heroine figure here of the liberation struggle, and I'm not trying to repeat the trappings of the officializing state-sponsored meta-narrative. Hers is an incredibly complicated narrative that, as I see it, helps us frame a number of entry points for telling these difficult histories that move us beyond the typical historiography of the period. This denial of a more complex layering of history through the sanitized version of what is now the Mandela House presented to the public in the international tourist market does not include the history of the killing of a queer youth in that house. And it's perhaps one of the most glaring examples of where the queer and activist community there was suppressed or erased. However, the technologies now at our disposal can allow us to layer the story using multiple tools for mapping, text mining, and 3D visualization so that Winnie Mandela's narrative serves as a necessary transition into a difficult queer history that acts as more than the officializing memory of social justice and human rights. Digital humanities may actually help sort through it and can help both reconstruct and recover a history that is still very early in the telling, despite what we think we know about the liberation struggle, particularly the liberation struggle industry. The layering of the many narratives also helps lay bare the messiness of archive making, the methodologies of digital ethnography, and the endangered nature of archives across South Africa. I know how very charged the history is, particularly surrounding Winnie Mandela, Soweto in the 1980s, which has still not been fully told, and ultimately what we value when we find in the TRC's memory-making process, where we're also facing the disappearance of those records from the National Archives. I'm, as some might say, in very deep waters here, bringing up sort of the most troubling aspects of the kind of work I do in South Africa, and perhaps I'm in the deep end of the pool, and that requires, I would say, a much more careful feminist and gender-based praxis of collaboration and really working in community-based organizations to begin telling these stories. So the house at 8115 Vilakazi, as Winnie suggests, is not necessarily a typical house in an ordinary township. And it suggests instead that it's something very different. She perhaps was hinting, and in the rest of the interview, that any other house in Soweto could have been substituted for hers. But it was also the headquarters for most of the planning behind the student uprisings of June 1976. And in another portion of the interview, she makes clear that the house was a headquarters for every activity that took place in the country. It was the headquarters. All decisions were taken, even part of the 1976 uprising. The consultations took place there, so it was a hive of activity. Meetings took place right there because they never thought we would meet there. So what I'm arguing here is that resistance occurred under the guise or cloak of the domestic sphere in this ordinary house, as opposed to a resistance resulting from a kind of patriarchal imagination of the events that occurred. A fuller, more complex history of the uprisings has yet to be told, despite the perceived popularity of the uprisings for normalizing the history of the liberation struggle and Soweto's unique role in that narrative. Winnie Mandela was the victim of incarceration, physical violence, banning, and systematic harassment at the hands of the South African authorities, while her husband, Nelson Mandela, remained jailed for 27 years. She was detained and tortured by security forces in part for involvement and support of the Soweto uprisings of 1976. She was, like many other women involved in political struggles against colonial regimes, she has been the target of ongoing state violence and of state and media efforts to depict her as a wicked woman. Through the mid-1980s, Winnie Mandela became a vocal proponent of the ANC's use of strategic violence, a position she defended in a 1985 speech. Quote, "I will tell you why we are violent. It is because those who oppress us are violent. The Afrikaner knows only one language, the language of violence. All that is left to us is this painful process of violence." End of quote. We know that the blanket amnesty afforded by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the post-apartheid South African state, or the TRC, has been chipped away at, and with some cases even being reopened or re-examined to allow for possible individual prosecutions for grievous acts. In her video clip, Winnie Mandela also seems very cognizant that she and other former activists or students could easily be put back into jeopardy. Later in the same interview, she says that those of us who were part of the 1976 uprisings will have to tell their own stories, and that she will not be so presumptuous as to do it for them. The TRC eventually found her politically and morally accountable for the gross violations in human rights committed by the Mandela United Football Club, which essentially assisted in the killing of these queer youth. The commission quote, finds that she had failed to account to the community and political structures. The commission also found that she was responsible by omission for the commission of gross human rights violations. So if that house at 8115 Vilakazi was reinterpreted, not only to include the officializing narrative of the TRC, which it currently depicts, but if a multi-layered spatial microhistory were to be told, displayed or rendered visible through virtual technologies, we could easily imagine a radical queer politics and feminist analysis for understanding the contributions of South Africa's LGBTQI community to its liberation history, something severely lacking in the historiography of the period. So in other words, can we tell a history of the typical township house at 8115 Vilakazi? And we know that the contentious public memory generated by the TRC allowed South Africa to advance to a democratic praxis because it laid bare the many inconsistencies in collective shared values and goals. Public memory, like other forms of memory, exists on a broad spectrum between memory as object and memory as process. Memory at times becomes more fixed in the public imaginary, and at other times primarily consists of contestation over how to remember the past. Historian John Bardner argues that memory emerges from, quote, the intersection of official and vernacular cultural expression, end of quote. Official and vernacular interests, including their complex contextual politics availability of resources, and transnational pressures are often too entangled and overlapping to make Bodnar's opposition applicable or even viable when we consider South Africa's racialized context. The TRC's state-sanctioned status enabled them to transform what is widespread knowledge into formally recognized truths. This process allows the state to acknowledge its misdeeds. Fortunately, this process has not, however, made certain that the state-sanctioned official narrative of events became circumcised in all the extant physical locations of the liberation struggle. Alex Moraine, deputy chairperson of the commission, describes the commission as a kind of third way of dealing with the past, one that prioritizing truth-gathering and reconciliation over retributive justice. For Moraine, quote, South Africans desperately needed to create a common memory that could be acknowledged by those who created and implemented the apartheid system, by those who fought against it, and by the many more who were in the middle and claimed not to know what was happening in the country, end of quote. This production of a common officializing memory of the apartheid past constituted a multifaceted effort to create a new democratic South Africa. And also at the urgings of the Rehabilitation and Reparations Committee of the TRC, a one-time payment of approximately $4,000 was paid to over 15,000 victims and family members as urgent interim repatriation operation. The recommendations of that committee were included in TRC's final report. However, that committee lacked an enforcement mechanism and could thus only make recommendations to the government. So finally, what I'm really arguing for is that despite the abundance of these 3D virtual environments for historic sites that have emerged over the past decade, it becomes really important to think about the ways in which we can integrate these into a process of reconciliation making, reparations, payment, and also ways of advancing social justice. I think I'm going to end here so that we can have a little bit of time to have questions and to talk more. I like to leave things on a question rather than any profound statement. So thank you. So I'm portably mic'd, so I'm free to walk around finally. Any questions? I know I've thrown a lot your way.
Sorry, can I, just to start us off as everybody's thinking about all of the stuff you laid out for us, I'm really interested in the fact that you built this 3D modeling platform, you call it the social justice platform.
History platform.
Love that. That you built that on a gaming architecture. Can you talk a little bit about the choices that went into that and how you sort of conceptualized that and why you came to that?
In part, the reason we are using this gaming software is because it's sort of become the gold standard for archaeological and historical reconstruction work in general. So it's really informed by some of my work in archaeology, some of my work to actually document these heritage sites that are being lost, in particular in Soweto because of sort of the heritage tourist industry that's sort of grown up around township tourism. And if you see from the model of the house itself, we're using a lot of the technology to also document surfaces and textures that actually exist there. Because some of those textures and sort of visualizations of the site are slowly being chipped away at or being destroyed because of these new tourist markets that are coming up. So in an effort to try to document this, we're also trying to follow some standards of sort of archaeological practice that are being used sort of internationally to document. So this gaming platform has become a way into that process. It's not without its issues, it's not without all of the kind of trappings that happen when you begin to use something that's not completely open source as well. So there are some challenges there. On top of the kinds of challenges of displaying this in a web browser in South Africa, particularly because of bandwidth issues. So there becomes a whole host of issues that come up when trying to sort of represent this. Part of the way we've sort of figured out a bit of a workaround is to actually install this on computers in the museum so that it can be accessed in a way that isn't currently available. But again, part of the work is also to sort of test the ways in which we might think about access and accessibility and the challenges of access and accessibility, particularly in the Global South. I often have to tell my students, some of our other work has been in Tanzania. And Tanzania, for any of you who may have traveled there or know, they constantly have rolling blackouts. So what happens when you can't even turn on a computer without power, right? You don't have access to electricity. What then, or how then, do we sort of solve the problem of working in community with the digital when one doesn't even have the electricity to sort of power up your computer? We've come up with some clever solutions. Colleagues at Georgia Tech have actually developed sort of mobile oral history units that take solar power and allow this to sort of be the way to access some of these narratives and to gather some of these narratives. A colleague has done some work to actually install solar suitcases in women's health clinics across Tanzania. So we've also looked at working with women's organizations in Tanzania in an effort to try to collect those narratives, because there's a very interesting story about Tanzanian women who married South African freedom fighters, because so many South African men and women went to Tanzania in the midst of all sort of upheaval, and many of these women had been promised by their South African male partners that they would be able to go back. The ANC government basically said, you can come back to South Africa when we finally free the country. Well, that never really happened. Many of these women were abandoned in Tanzania, and they were never sort of brought back and sort of made South African citizens. So part of our work has also been to sort of figure out ways in which we can engage those women's organizations that are trying to make claims back in South Africa. And so we've thought about some interesting ways of bringing technology there, but also the challenges of electricity. So part of that work has been to also bring health care to the most rural parts of Tanzania. And we've also thought that this would be the entry point for working with these women's organizations to collect these histories of their work in the anti-apartheid struggle. So it's a complicated layering. One of the things we haven't yet explored but would like to is cell phone technology, because cell phone technology would allow us, cell phone technology is so far advanced in South Africa, our phones are nothing compared to the kind of technology that exists in other parts of the world. And so even in the most rural areas of South Africa, you can do banking on your phone. So we'd like to try to figure out ways in which we can access some mobile technology, particularly working with phone companies to try to get maybe through Twitter or other means to sort of crowdsource maybe even narratives in different kinds of ways. We're not quite there yet. We're really trying to figure out sort of the technology and try to see ways that we can take this portably, but we really want to sort of make that our next big challenge in terms of cell phones. Starting point.
Okay, sure. So I've actually been in South Africa, in Soweto, right outside the Mandela House, but that was in 2012 when he was still alive. He was actually in the hospital at the time. And I was wondering, of course, since when I was there wasn't a museum or anything like that, what is the ultimate goal for that space? I know that you want to get technology in there, and like who are you hoping for it to be open to and all that?
That particular house, the way it's been interpreted, is going to be a pretty static interpretation. I've been visiting that house for over a decade now, and the preservation and sort of curation plan for that house has changed at least 3 or 4 times in the decade that I've been sort of traveling there. The house in its most unique form and its most original form is actually filled with historical items and documents related to the family, related to the anti-apartheid struggle. And at some point, one of the preservation and heritage sort of planning companies that came in decided that the best strategy would be to strip the house of everything and to turn it almost into a blank sort of canvas. So the condition in which you would see it now, it has a couple of video screens that sort of tell some of the history of the house. You're able to sort of walk up to these sound recordings and sort of hear Winnie and other members of the family tell stories, but it's a very sanitized one sort of layer, mega layer of the house and their relationship to it. But how that house is representative of different narratives and different stories isn't being told. And so the hope is to begin to engage those people in the community who haven't been able to tell their stories, who haven't been able to sort of layer their narrative on top of that. Alongside the anti-apartheid struggle was a very strong queer activist community that really has been erased. And if we sort of look at the way in which AIDS happened in Southern Africa and happened in a place like South Africa in particular, so there were disavowing of sort of the decimation of the community by HIV and AIDS, I think it's going to be a very different narrative, because suddenly we're going to see that there were queer activists working in and out of churches and schools, really trying to end the apartheid era, alongside sort of the more standard meta-narratives that we know of Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela. So the effort here is also to engage another part of the community that's been silenced on a number of different levels. But again, it's difficult because, as in most things, politics plays a huge part in this. And when Jacob Zuma was in power, when Thabo Mbeki was in power, it was actually much easier, or when he was president, it was much easier to work in community and with community. But now that Jacob Zuma has been president, a lot of community members are very resistant to telling their stories. I think there's a certain level of uncertainty because of some of the difficulties he's had in his presidency, and some of the unclear ways in which policies are being overturned or ignored under his administration. So there's a lot of negotiation that happens, as with any community-based project, any community work. You've always got to be ready for the kinds of challenges when you're embedded in organizations that depend on community as a whole to make up their sort of base. So it's a constant negotiation that we're sort of involved in.
Have you spoken to the Tutu family, the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, his son, or anything like that? Because they seem like they're very interested in the same sort of preservation of stories and the different kinds of beliefs you have where you want to make sure that these stories are heard and all of that. Have you spoken at all with that family and worked with them at all?
No, I haven't with the Tutu family. Some of it is accessibility to the family through the kinds of relationships that one has. And again, I think some of the difficulty is that much of the sort of heritage industry in South Africa has also been dominated by a kind of white heritage class that has been sort of keeping control over the narrative. So there's a lot of suspicion about outsiders sort of coming in and sort of working on the materials. So it's taken a good many years to develop the strong relationships that I already have. And Tutu hasn't been someone that's been available, largely because he mostly resides also in Cape Town, as opposed to residing in Johannesburg. So there's a big sort of geographic disconnect there. But definitely someone I should put on the list to talk to. Great questions.
Maybe you covered this, but what is your relationship with the Apartheid Museum?
Not much of one, largely because the Apartheid Museum is not one of the township museums that exists. There's a whole series of township museums across Johannesburg, and the Apartheid Museum was a completely different entity, developed in part as a negotiation to build across the street the casino that was built. And so the developers were asked to basically do something in trade for the community or for the nation. And so their trade was that they supported the building of the Apartheid Museum. And the Apartheid Museum is just a completely different animal in terms of the kinds of politics involved in it. It's not really a part of the city of Johannesburg's museums.
But would you want that? I mean, especially when you're talking about, like, who has access to this, in South Africa? Like, how do you hope the...
Black South Africans don't really go to the Apartheid Museum, right, in part. They do go to the township museums, in part, to try to educate youth about it. The Apartheid Museum is also sort of located a bit outside of the township, so accessibility is also a big issue to that museum. And that museum has had sort of an interesting but troubled kind of history in terms of how it's telling that particular story. Again, it goes back to the politics of curation and museum making. Very interesting to also sort of do a study of the different museums and how they sort of, their pecking order and how they've also sort of received funding or not received funding from the state. So I've really been focused on those museums in the townships that are part of the city of Johannesburg's sort of purview of museums. And that's a pretty prescribed list, a good many of them. The Kliptown Museum is a part of that. There are others, and again, it's a constant negotiation of resources when you're sort of dealing with these many museums. I mean, part of the other interesting issue is that the city is never really quite sure what its financial basis is going to be from any given year to year. So the funding has seriously declined in terms of the funding being provided to these museums, which also creates some problems. Like Museum Africa has very recently one of the largest Africana collections in the world is in threat of being closed. And they basically do not have a curator heading up that museum at the moment, their archive. So it's basically shut that museum off to researchers and to anyone wanting to sort of know the history of Johannesburg or the history of South Africa. It's become very problematic. Museums in South Africa are very contested, as in most countries on the African continent. But in particular, Johannesburg has a really complex set of issues, many of them financial, which you wouldn't imagine given sort of the gold industry and diamond industry that undergirds so much of the development in South Africa. It's pretty fraught. And as an American and as an outsider, it also has sort of its issues. I've just been real consistent, and I've been showing up for 10 years. So, you know, it's been an interesting negotiation with community. It's incredibly fascinating, but incredibly challenging, and a lot of negotiation and meetings to sort of get where one needs to. Great questions.
What started you 10 years ago?
I was chasing down a footnote. I was chasing down a footnote. I'm really like old school nerdy historian. I was chasing down a footnote because I wanted to round out the book project with a third woman. You know, publishers don't like stories with, if you're doing sort of a biography, they don't really like stories, or a group biography, they don't really like two. It's too much comparative. It's sort of like three. So I was searching for a third woman and came across this South African woman, Charlotte Makeke, who in 1908 went to Wilberforce. Why was this woman from South Africa at Wilberforce in 1908? I was very curious about this, managed to convince a dean from my former School of Architecture to let me go to South Africa to sort of research her. I ended up on the doorstep of the Hector Peterson Museum. I had developed an email relationship with the curator, and he said, well, I've got a problem I need solved. And he said, come with me, and we went down into the archive, and he said, there's rainwater coming into my archive. I have 20 cassette tapes. For those of you who don't know what cassettes are, look it up. I have 20 cassette tapes that are in danger. These are original recordings with student activists, and they're in danger of, you know, being lost. Could there be some way to, you know, save these or digitize these? And I said, sure, I can do that. 10 years later, yeah, I've gone down that rabbit hole and just keep on. And yeah, it's been a very interesting. I'm not trained as a South African historian. I'm an African-American women's historian. Already an oddball enough coming out of architecture and sort of women's studies in that kind of vein, but South Africa just happened by accident. As many of us, when we get PhDs, you don't end up teaching exactly what it is you studied. So yeah, it's been a very interesting trajectory. Great question.
Angel. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Okay,
Sure.
I'm sure you talked about this, but
Sure.
could you talk more about building the model of the house?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what kind of data did you
Yeah.
use? Do you have small data, big data, dimensions? Because I'm sort of thinking about my own project, and I work on a mosque that's in the 16th century, so I don't really have, my data is very small, and I just wondered, like,
Sure,
if you
sure.
could talk about the mechanics of that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Part of the issue with working in the townships has been that I basically had to build the archive around sort of the townships. for as much as people go to see them and experience them, the sort of physical evidence of the construction of the townships is pretty hard to come by, and it's in very different kinds of archives. So what we've done is, over the years, I've basically done kind of like a recovery mission to try to get as many of the architectural drawings. And actually, the last batch, and I mentioned these drawings from the National Archives, I would have only found these. I only found these because I happened to be speaking with someone, an archivist at the archive, who said to me, there's a stack of like interesting architectural plans that I don't know if you've seen them. Nobody's looked at these in a really long time. Would you be interested in these? So accidental has been also a part of this sort of project, but we're fortunate to have some small data that we've been able to build. These are all measured drawings, off of measured drawings in some instances. There's been a little bit of educated guesswork around sort of the building of some of it. I do a lot of photography work, so it's been an effort to try to document what remnants there are still of that sort of past landscape that I can photograph to then use while we're modeling, or sort of the current landscape, because again, we're trying to show the expanse of this 120 sort of year history of Soweto. So trying to tell that particular narrative in Johannesburg has meant going to a lot of different sources. So textual, oral, photographs. One of the challenges of doing the work in Soweto has been, at one point when I was there, it was very easy to access all of the photographs that were taken after the riots. They were all part of a collection at the National Archive. That collection is now lost. So documentary evidence that I could have used to sort of build up this case about the changes in the landscape, I now don't have access to those photos because they're missing. So it's very spotty in terms of what's there, and you may go to a collection and find something, and then if you return to that collection months or years later, suddenly it's missing. So it's a big challenge in terms of just the preservation of historical documents. But it's sort of in crisis mode everywhere on the continent, but in particular in South Africa, because it's so tied to contestation over who was a part of the narrative, who wasn't, and are people going to be prosecuted at any point in that process now, since the TRC is slowly being sort of chipped away at. So we've had students actually building the models, so that's another thing we do. We teach the students, we work with students, undergraduates, on how to build the models. And then we sort of go back to the community and sort of show folks what we're developing and try to negotiate that process.
Do they import these architectural drawings?
Yeah, they import the architectural drawings. We are able to import them into, we use Blender as the drawing tool. So we import the architectural drawings into Blender, and we use those as the base from which we sort of draw up and sort of build from there. Other colleagues use SketchUp as their, but we went with Blender, just it was more open source. So we went with Blender. So we use Blender, we make the models, and then we import them into Unity, to that 3D engine. But the platform, the social justice platform, is all being built within Unity. So it's a very different kind of workflow to sort of build that inside the game engine.
Is Unity also a visualization tool?
It's a gaming tool. So you can do all kinds of gaming, you can use all kinds of gaming conventions in it. And it's a very interesting platform. It's had some updates most recently, and now suddenly Unity doesn't work in Chrome. So every time you are making an advance, there's always something that sort of kicks you in the butt in terms of technology, and you have to be ready to sort of change. That will change. It will be available in Chrome eventually. It's just one of these things. You have to sort of, some people ask me, my dean famously asks me, why haven't I done more in the past 10 years in terms of the model? And sometimes I'm not quite sure which answer I should really give to that question. So I try to be as polite as possible and say, well, you know, we're trying to stay as ahead as you can of the technologies, but every once in a while the technology throws you a curve, and then you've got to scrap everything and start again. So it's a challenge working in 3D. You would imagine that, given this day and age, that these technologies would be rather easy to use, easy to access, available. No, not in the least. And then trying to sort of make these applicable and usable in a community-based setting to do community-based work takes on a whole other host of issues, as I tried to outline. So it's a pretty complicated endeavor, but I think the 3D allows the community, from what I've experienced with them, it allows the community to tell these kinds of stories that aren't possible in the physical world that exists now, about these disappeared landscapes, or even about these moments of contestation over history. I'll say one more thing and then be quiet. For example, Hector Peterson was shot on a particular street, and I've gotten interesting video footage of his sister and a community elder sort of talking about, no, he fell here, no, he fell there. Well, the city of Johannesburg decided to mark the site where Hector fell 3 blocks away, because it was going to be easier for buses and tourists to drive past and to take pictures from the bus window, so they didn't have to get out of the buses. So, they've then imposed another narrative and marked a spot. I mean, this is like, a national heritage site. They've marked this place. It's on the side of, the road, and it was also on the same road that the Nelson Mandela House and the Tutu House were on, simply because you get one bus down and see as many things as you can. Just shift from one side of the bus to the other and take all those pictures, because they couldn't get the bus down the road where actually he fell. So suddenly they've changed the entire narrative. So the 3D platform is an effort to try to say, wait a minute, there's a different way that we need to tell these stories, and there's a much truer way to tell these narratives if we can reconstruct those moments and say, okay, well, at least we know he fell in this vicinity, not 3 blocks away, and this tells a particular narrative versus the site 3 blocks away, which is not a historical, really a historical place in that narrative. Anyway, that's sort of the hope, but it's definitely a challenge.
Just to follow up,
Sure.
have you tried to, in terms of, a technology outpacing the model, have you tried to embed the model in a particular version of that technology so that it would always work? As opposed to just not being able to keep up with the updates.
It's very hard to do. So one of the things that I've also been involved with, and Andrew knows this, also been involved with trying to have our professional organizations, particularly places like the Society of Architectural Historians and the American Archaeological Association, has also been trying to find ways to document those particular moments in the life cycle of the project, so that it can be a part of a publication, so that we do record those moments, or we can talk about the process of building and how complicated it is. Yeah, I mean, there are several versions. If you sort of go to the original Soweto 76 a Living Digital Archive site, you'll see a very early version. But again, we were able to keep that version because we basically made a QuickTime film of it. But even some of my colleagues who've done a lot of this work for much longer than I, for 2 decades, have experienced issues with Flash no longer existing. Flash not being capable to be used. So suddenly all these visualizations that they made using Flash made their project useless. So there are a lot of technical challenges that come with this. So trying to find ways to document the production of the models, but also still have them be a part of that narrative for community, it is still the kind of challenge to find the interface, right, between a physical book and an online sort of archive, trying to mediate some of that. We're in the midst of a lot of discussions with presses to try to figure out how we can do that, right? Because I would love for people to be able to have a physical book that sort of makes these arguments and tells this story, but I would also like to have a companion that goes with a website, and not that one replicates the other, but that they're in conversation with one another, or that they can stand apart from one another. We're not quite there yet. We're sort of building those platforms now. And a lot of presses are doing some really interesting stuff around that, but it's definitely a challenge around 3D models. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Angel. Thank you very much. And I just want to note that there's still probably